special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts from ICT's annual international conference.
I'm Dan Diker, and this is IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, and we are here at the International Institute for Counterterrorism in the Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya, at the 15th Annual World Summit on Counterterrorism. And in fact, this year's summit is called the Shifting Sands of Terror, and I am sitting opposite one of the great legal scholars in the context of the shifting sands of terror, Professor William Banks, who is the Dean of the Law School at Syracuse University and also the founding director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism there at Syracuse University. Sir, it's really a pleasure to have you back. I think it's your 11th time. This is almost, it's almost like homecoming once again back to Israel. You're part of the Israeli counterterror and larger family.
I certainly am. Thank you, Dan. It's great to be back. It's home away from home.
Well, that's music, I think, to the ears of certainly every Israeli. And I want to get a sense from you, Professor. Is the United States prepared from a legal point of view to upgrade its fight against radical Islamic terror?
It's doing better. I think, there's the old joke about two Irishmen meeting each other on a road outside of Dublin, each walking in the opposite direction, and one stops the other and says, can you tell me how to get to Galway? And the other guy says, I wouldn't start from here. So in the counterterrorism perspective, I think many in the U.S. a few years after 9/11 would have given that answer to the question. We're in a terrible legal predicament because we did so many things sort of haphazardly and ad hoc after 9/11, indeed because we had to, without a lot of time to plan. So for the last decade, I'd say now, we've been struggling to shape a legal fabric, an architecture for countering terrorism in the United States. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we've made considerable progress in the last decade or so. Work still remains to be done, but at international law and in the laws of the United States, I think we're not only better situated, but we're more on the same page with our partners, including the State of Israel, and how we go about countering terrorism.
What single piece of legislation would you attribute a greater flexibility for U.S. law enforcement and national security and counterterrorism officials to use in order to prevent terrorism as opposed to react to it?
Probably the biggest legislative vehicle in the United States is our FISA, our Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which has allowed, really since 1978, for the secret conduct of electronic surveillance and physical searches against those who may possess foreign intelligence, including, of course, intelligence pertaining to international terrorism. That legislation's gone through many iterations, amendments, and some challenges over now more than 35 years, but particularly as amended recently, even this year in 2015, the statute is a really effective tool for learning about the bad things that might happen and having an opportunity to thwart them before they can ripen.
You know, Professor Banks, here at the ICT, I was honored to do an advanced degree in counterterrorism here and have joined the Institute. And one of the issues that we've dealt with is the issue of profiling.
Yes.
And I refrain from using the word racial profiling because in the United States, that becomes the operative concept. When you use the word profiling, all the red flags go up, the lights go up. But we, in the debate here at the ICT, the notion was, and Israel does profile,
yes,
not on the basis necessarily of race, creed, or color, but on the basis of indications. Whom do you know? Where have you been? Where are your passports? Where are your relationships? How is it? Help us understand that conversation in the U.S. context. Is it possible to get to a type of and I use profiling with great sensitivity within the U.S. Constitution and the critical preservation of the rights of the individual in the United States?
Well, that's a great question. And one of the things that's made the problem so much more complex in the United States is the size of it, the number of people that we have to deal with. Israel's a small country. You can talk to everybody. I've seen it in action here. I've been stopped at the airport in the way that we all are and been subjected to that questioning. It's very effective, and it's very professional and very respectful of every person, I'd have to say. We're coming in that direction in the United States, and we allow the kind of questioning that you just gave, for example, of talking to an individual about where he comes from, who his associates are, and so on. And yet the race categories, religion, ethnic, sexual preference, those kinds of labels may not become the basis for picking out a target for an investigation. What we do now in the United States is we allow the use of a characteristic like that to be operative in an investigation only when a suspect has been identified who fits one of those traits. If a suspect has been identified as a Middle Eastern man between 18 and 25 who's got dark complexion and a beard, that kind of information can be given to the investigators, and they may, in effect, profile on the basis of those characteristics.
Yeah, but a priori they won't profile.
That's right.
Yeah, that's where Israel and the United States differ on that legal point.
It is exactly.
Can it be done? Israel's very successful. You know, Israel, I guess we should say knock on wood or something like that.
Yeah.
But Israel has about 100% in recent years success rate in preventing any kind of air terrorism or many forms of ground transportation terrorism, because they have the security forces in the neighborhoods already at a far earlier stage than the American legal system allows it to be.
Right. I think we're going to continue to face that dilemma in the United States because of our constitutional values and the insistence by many that those civil liberties protections not permit forward-looking profiling policy.
Where is when you look at the global scene as an American scholar of international law and terrorism, counterterrorism, where do you see the major threat today for the United States?
I think the major threat today is in North Africa, Eastern Africa, South Asia, I think, and in the former Soviet Union and Russia in particular. I think the United States is very worried about Russia as a nation state because of the erratic behavior of Mr. Putin and some of his allies, the actions that were undertaken in the Ukraine, the threats elsewhere in the region. I think there's a great fear among NATO countries of provocations by Russia, and that has the United States in turn very worried. And on the terrorism front, I think we're worried increasingly about the actions in Africa, Northern Africa, but also Eastern and Central Africa and South Asia. I think our attention will be focused there.
You know, when we look around the region here in the Middle East, one rather compelling fact is that when you think about the Islamic State, which they call here Daesh, or the president calls it not the Islamic State, but he calls it ISIL, the Islamic State in the Levant. It's compelling to note that none of the Middle East monarchies have fallen. They have been successful in semi-failed states such as Iraq and total failed states such as Syria, essentially today. There is no real Syria today. How do we begin to understand the failure at this juncture of ISIS in the Gulf states, the monarchies, including Jordan, versus their extraordinarily swift takeover, kidnapping, hijacking of these other states, such as Iraq, begin with Iraq and Syria?
Well, in a way, I think you've answered your own question. I think it's the very structure of those states. I think the infrastructure that even a heavy-handed autocratic state can bring to bear on maintaining its borders and assuring central services and having an effective military and law enforcement and intelligence presence make the barriers too difficult for a group like Daesh. Mm-hmm. Whether it's Egypt or Jordan or one of the other states in the region, they simply have the resources to protect their own sovereignty. Even if the state of Israel or the United States has fundamental objections to the way those governments run their own affairs, there are allies with respect to dealing with a threat from the Islamic State.
True. You know, that particular relationship between America and its traditional Middle East allies and Israel, or Israel included, has really been uprooted. I don't think it's too strong a word to use in the last 6 years by U.S. policy. I mean, U.S. policy has really turned the traditional America's traditional allies, they call them partners. I'm not quite sure why. I think they're allies, on its head. The question becomes, how does one move forward? That kind of restructuring of America's relationships in the Middle East is going to, it seems to take an awfully long time. Is there a way that America can do that by introducing some legal assistance to Iraq in building societies, or Syria in helping them build federal societies, perhaps? It looks like they're going the federal route.
The federal route was popularized early in the Bush administration, before the takeover, before the United States sort of ran the country for a few years. And I think the the idea of a federal republic with the Kurds in one area is actually one of the most appealing of all the prospects that could have been implemented at the time. Now, again, a decade later, I think the prospect of having a Kurdish region, a Sunni and a Shia divide is plausible. And I think, yes, I think the United States could do much more there. It's safe to say there's a lot of disagreement to the Obama administration's tendency in the last couple of years, post-surge, to essentially pull back and let the Iraqis try to make it on their own. I think there will be, whoever wins the presidential election in the United States, I think it's inevitable that there'll be a greater U.S. presence in a soft power way in trying to rebuild an Iraqi society, whether it's in a federated system or some other.
Well, this is what Ahmed Chalabi, the
Yes.
Iraqi lawmaker, was talking about, and notwithstanding, and I think I'll use this platform to say, notwithstanding a lot of the incitement that was used against Dr. Chalabi, he was talking about building an Iraqi state that was federal in nature, using the model of the United States, which is the greatest example of federal democracy that the world has known in hundreds of years.
That's right. His ally in the United States at the time was Vice President Joe Biden. Mr. Biden believed in that and gave speeches touting the value of a sort of a federal republic, but he was outvoted by his commander-in-chief at the time.
He was. Well, you know, I've had conversations with Palestinian colleagues because, as you know very well, one of the greatest claims, certainly in international academia, perhaps Syracuse notwithstanding, would be the notion that the Palestinian issue is like that's what's underpinning all of the, or no, that's a bad word, that's the greatest cause of all of the instability in the Middle East. And the colleagues on the Palestinian side and the Jordanian side and I have sort of bandied around a model of federalism for the Palestinians.
Yes.
So they say, well, what does that mean? We say, well, in the same way that New York and New Jersey are two states within a federal system and each has a local security force and a local government, the same could be for a Palestinian federal state as well as the Hashemite Kingdom, Jordan, and Israel. So you can have, well, with Israel it would be more of a confederation because Israel has its own sovereignty. But do you see the outline, a blueprint for that, for the Palestinians working with Jordanians? Because the prevailing logic and the prevailing thinking is no, can't happen. It has to be two completely different states, Jordan and the Palestinian entity.
I think it's a workable model. I think what hasn't been mentioned yet is Gaza. That complicates that equation very significantly. If you leave Gaza out of it, then I think it's not so difficult to imagine some sort of an agreement about a confederation, as you put it correctly, that still respects Israeli sovereignty, of course, but grants a measure of sovereignty to the Palestinians on the West Bank.
We may be able to solve that concern you have, because if you and I mean, if we were on the radio, nobody's really listening. So,
yeah.
And you talk to West Bankers, they really want nothing to do with people in Gaza.
That's right.
Different families,
Right.
different history, different culture.
Yeah.
But then again, you know, those of us in the international mainstream media always succeed to emphasize all too frequently points that are not in line with what the discussion is among Palestinians themselves, and that's why we're considered the educated media.
That's right.
So, but that's why we're sitting in here, is to understand really, to try to get the deeper thinking behind traditional superficial media. That's what IDC Radio, by the way, is about, to really get underneath the issues.
Does it very well.
I think, well, that's wonderful. That's terrific. So the question is, what have you learned from your Israeli counterparts here when you go back to Syracuse and you teach students and you run the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism? What lesson or two or message or two do you bring back from Israel in your intellectual mind?
I learned so much here, and as you know, I do some teaching here in the executive program. I always learn so much from my Israeli students, and I learn a great deal. I have Israeli colleagues visiting on the faculty at Syracuse. One of the most important ingredients of the Israeli experience that informs our work in the United States is operational experience, having lived it. Having lived through the intifadas, having lived through the various operations, say, since 2006, that involve incursions across the border from the north or from the south, and understanding the dilemmas that confront decision makers who have to operate in a split second to make a move, to respond or not respond, attack or not attack. So much from the IDF lawyers who've come in to talk to the classes here and the workshops and conferences that we've run. The theory is fine, but it's very different when it's tested in a real-life situation. We have very little experience with that in the United States unless you're deployed. Sitting back in New York State or somewhere else, you just can't feel it. Here you can feel it. And getting that has been so very important every time.
Well, it's great to hear. Professor William Banks, Road Testing Counterterrorism. That's a great title for...
We'll make a bumper sticker.
I think we could, and it might even sell.
It
might even sell. I'd like to, at this point, just thank you, Professor William Banks, the Dean of the Law School at Syracuse University, the founding executive director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism there, and a renowned professor of international law and terrorism, counterterrorism. Really a pleasure to have you here at IDC Radio and at the conference. And we are banking, pardon the word, on the 12th year next year. We're already planning for that.
I'll see you next year, Dan.
God
Thanks
willing.
very much.
Thank you all very much.